They say the cabin of Samuel Crawford never once showed a light in its window for 6 years. Not a single woman made it up that mountain road. Not a single fire burned warm enough to make anyone want to stay. Then one February morning, a woman stepped down from a stagecoach, pulled her scarf down, and the hardest mountain man in all of Montana Territory stood frozen in the mud like he'd forgotten his own name. That's where most people start the story. But to understand why that moment mattered, why it still gets told around fires on cold nights in this part of the country, you have to go back a little further. You have to start with the man himself, with what he was before she arrived and what that kind of life does to a person over time. Samuel Crawford came to the Montana high country 11 years before all this. He was 27 years old, big through the shoulders, unhurried in his speech in the manner of men who have learned that most words don't earn the air they use. He'd scouted for the Army up along the northern territories, trapped beaver and marten along the river systems, and somewhere in those years developed the particular skill set of a man the frontier respects and civilization forgets about. He could read weather by the angle a raven held its wings. He could track elk through 2 feet of fresh snow and tell you how old the prints were by the way the edges had settled. He could set a dislocated shoulder against a pine tree without making a sound. What he could not do, what he had never been particularly good at, was living alongside other people for any length of time without feeling like he was wearing a coat 2 sizes too small. The cabin sat at 4,200 feet on the eastern shoulder of a ridge the Crow people called the place where the wind argues with itself. Samuel had built it over one summer with timber. He felled himself a stone hearth wide enough to heat a family, and a loft he'd framed out with the optimism of a younger man. He'd meant it to be a proper home. He'd had a wife named Anna, and Anna was the kind of woman who could make a proper home out of considerably less than what he'd built her. She died in the winter of their 3rd year on the mountain. Childbirth, and then a fever, and then a silence that moved into the cabin and never left. After Anna, Samuel did what a certain kind of man does when the world takes something he doesn't know how to live without. He didn't leave. He didn't drink himself to ruin down in the settlements. He stayed on the mountain and he worked, and he let the work replace everything else until the days had a shape to them that didn't require feeling anything in particular. He trapped. He hunted. He sold hides in the spring and bought what he needed and went back up. That was the whole of it for 6 years. The nearest neighbor was a trapper named Holt, 7 miles south along the ridge. Holt was a practical man with a practical man's talent for knowing when to talk and when to leave well enough alone. He'd stop in every few weeks in good weather more often. They'd drink coffee by the fire and might go an entire visit without exchanging more than a dozen words, and both of them considered that a successful social occasion. The nearest settlement was Pell's Crossing, a trading post, and a handful of structures that called itself a town, the way a man with 3 cards calls himself a card player. 18 miles down a mountain road that became a muddy threat in spring and an outright promise of hardship from October through April. Samuel went down to Pell's Crossing when he had to, not before. He was not by any measurement a man living well. He was a man living, which is a different thing entirely. On the morning he finally wrote the letter that changed everything. There was nothing dramatic about it. No vision, no revelation, no particular sign from above. He sat down to breakfast and put 2 cups on the table. He'd been doing that for 6 years. Every single morning, 2 cups. He couldn't have told you why if you'd asked him. He'd stopped asking himself. He set his coffee down and sat across from the empty one. Held it in his mind a moment the way a man holds a splinter he can't quite get at. Then he stood up and went about his morning. Holt came by that afternoon. They checked the south trap line together and came back to the cabin as the light was going thin and gold through the pine trees. Holt sat at the table. Samuel put coffee on. Holt's eyes moved around the cabin the way they sometimes did a slow, honest inventory. The pelts on the wall, the traps on their hooks, the skinning board, the single plate drying by the basin, the 2 cups still on the table. He said nothing about any of it. He drank his coffee. He talked a little about the weather coming in from the northwest. He mentioned that the Billings stage was running a week behind on account of a washed-out crossing down in the valley. Then he set his cup down, stood up, and pulled on his coat. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "You doing all right up here, Crawford?" Samuel was staring at the fire. "Fine," he said. Holt nodded at the door. "All right," and he left. That night Samuel sat at the table long after the fire had burned down to coals. Then he got up and found a piece of paper and a pencil stub and sat back down. He wrote a letter, read it over, folded it, put it in the fire. He watched it burn. Then he found a second piece of paper and wrote again. This one took longer. He stopped twice, held the pencil over the page without writing, started again. He read it back. Put that one in the fire too. He watched the second letter curl into ash. Then he got out a third piece of paper, the last good one he had, and wrote very quickly, like a man who knows that if he slows down, he'll stop again. He folded it before he could read it back. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He went to bed. In the morning he gave it to Holt to carry down to the post office at Pell's Crossing. "Don't ask," he said. Holt didn't ask, just tucked it away and rode south. Nobody ever found out what was in the first two letters. Only Samuel knew. And he was not a man who volunteered things. The reply came 6 weeks later. A letter from an agency in Billings informing Mr. Crawford that a suitable match had been identified, that arrangements were being made, and that the young woman in question would arrive by stage in the first week of February. Her name was Clara Bowen, age 29, no family of record, capable of household management, cooking, basic mending, and medical care. In good health. The letter did not mention anything else about her. Samuel read it once, folded it, put it in the same coat pocket as the original, and went out to check his traps. He didn't think about it again for 3 days. Then he thought about it constantly. Not about Clara Bowen specifically. He had no picture of her, no real information, no way to form a person out of those spare sentences. What occupied him was the arrangement itself, the practical architecture of it. Another presence in the cabin, another voice at the table, another set of footsteps on the floorboards in the morning. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd been dreading it, or how much he'd been waiting for it, both at the same time with the same intensity, which was its own kind of trouble. He chased the notion off every time it came near, the way you chase a dog away from the fire. Then it would come back and sit just outside the circle of light, patient watching. Moses Webb came up the mountain once during those 6 weeks. He sat by the fire with his coffee and took in the cabin with the unhurried attention of a man who has seen enough of the world to read a room the way other men read weather. Moses was somewhere past 60 and had been everything the frontier asks of a man before the frontier asks it, and then some. He'd scouted, traded, wintered with the Blackfoot, and outlasted 3 partners and a wife, and still came out the other side with all his opinions intact. He ran a few trap lines north of Samuel's Ridge and stopped in occasionally because the coffee was good and Samuel didn't talk too much. He sat there that evening and surveyed the single chair and the solitary plate and the empty loft and drank about half his coffee. "You sent for her," he said finally. "Letter went out last month," Samuel said. "And she's coming. Stage in February." Moses turned his cup in his hands. His eyes moved around the cabin again, the pelts and the traps and the dim corners and the one chair pulled to the table. Then he said, "You know what this place looks like?" Samuel was sharpening a blade. He didn't raise his eyes. "It looks like a cabin." "It looks like a den," Moses said. "It looks like a place an animal sleeps between hunts. No woman's going to want to stay in a den, Samuel." "I'm not asking her to want it," Samuel said. "I'm asking her to keep the fire, cook, help put up stores. That's the arrangement." Moses held his cup, and the fire said more than he did for a while. Then he stood, set down the cup, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. "You been out here so long," he said, "you forgot what a person is for." He went out into the dark. Samuel sat with that. Then he went back to the blade. But Moses's words had gotten in under his skin the way only the truth manages to. He turned and surveyed the cabin that night, really took it in, and he saw what Moses saw. The pelts and the traps and the single plate, the functional misery of a place that had never once been asked to be anything more than shelter. He moved the second cup from the table to the shelf. He didn't put it back out in the morning. He told himself it was because it made sense. It did not make sense. He knew it didn't make sense. But he left it on the shelf, and he didn't examine why. February came cold and clean. Samuel rode down to Pell's Crossing on a Tuesday the way he sometimes did when the stores were running low after a long freeze. He tied his horses outside the trading post and went in to talk to Jed Pell about a supply order and some powder he'd been waiting on since October. He was loading the supply bags onto his pack horse when he heard the stage. He'd known the stage was running today. He'd told himself he'd forgotten. He hadn't forgotten. He kept his hands on the bags and kept his attention on the knots and listened to the stage pull up behind him in a spray of half-frozen mud, the horses blowing hard from the climb out of the valley. He heard the driver say something, heard a door. He finished the last knot, drew a breath. Then he turned around. The first passenger off was a man he didn't recognize. Heavy-set, good coat, the look of someone whose business involved other people's land. He stepped down with the confidence of a man who considers the ground his by right and walked straight into the trading post without acknowledgement. Samuel's attention stayed on the stage door. A woman stepped down. She came out carefully, not timidly, not hesitantly, the particular care of someone who has learned not to trust what looks solid until she's tested it herself. One foot, then the other. She found her footing and stood straight. She was dressed in dark wool, road-worn but clean. A long coat mended at the left cuff. A wide-brimmed hat with the brim angled against the wind. Her hair was dark. She was of medium height, but she carried herself like someone considerably larger. Back straight shoulders, settled chin at an angle that communicated without any particular effort that she had already decided not to apologize for being wherever she was. She carried a single trunk. It was not a large trunk. Samuel filed that detail away without meaning to. She took in Pell's Crossing the way a person takes in a place they've been told about but are seeing for the first time, registering it without committing to a verdict. Then her eyes found him. He was the only person standing outside. He was the only person who could be waiting for anything. She held his gaze directly, not searching, not hoping, not asking for anything at all, and she walked toward him across the frozen mud with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has learned that the manner of your approach matters almost as much as the approach itself. She stopped about 3 feet in front of him. She didn't say hello. She didn't offer a smile. She held his eyes for 1 beat, and then she reached up with both hands and unwound the scarf from the lower half of her face, slowly, deliberately, not like someone performing courage, like someone who had decided a very long time ago that she would be the one to control this particular moment and had gotten very practiced at it. The right side of her face was smooth. The left side carried a burn scar that ran from her cheekbone down to the corner of her jaw. Old scar healed clean. The skin pulled slightly tighter than the rest, drawing the corner of her eye and mouth just barely out of true. It didn't disfigure her so much as divide her 2 halves of the same face, telling 2 different parts of the same story. Samuel Crawford took her in. And then for just a second, maybe 2, his eyes dropped to the ground. He didn't do it because the scar horrified him. He'd seen worse injuries on men who hadn't survived lesser ones. He'd been burned himself on his left forearm the year he'd pulled a trapper's dog out of a burning camp. He understood what it cost a person to carry something visible that the world had decided was the most important thing about them. He dropped his eyes because of something else. Because what met him in her face in that moment, that quiet, exhausted, absolute refusal to ask for anything, hit him somewhere he hadn't known was still open. He recognized it. He straightened up. She held his gaze with the calm, careful attention of someone who has been studied her entire life and learned to study back. "You're Mr. Crawford," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled in the manner of something naturally low and warm that has learned to give nothing away. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You're Clara Bowen," she said. "The agency didn't give you complete information." Not a question. "I understand if the arrangement is void. I can take the next stage east." She delivered it the way a person states a fact they have already made peace with. No plea in it, no self-pity. Just here is the situation, here are the options, I will not beg for either one. Samuel regarded her a moment. "Where's the rest of your luggage?" he said. She blinked just once. "This is all of it." He walked to the trunk and picked it up. It was heavier than it appeared. "Horse is over here," he said, and started toward the roan. She stood there one beat. Then she followed. They were almost to the horses when a man's voice carried from the trading post doorway. "Crawford." Samuel recognized that voice. He stopped, turned. Marcus Dalton was leaning against the doorframe with his hat pushed back and his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who has just seen something he expected and finds it satisfying for reasons he doesn't intend to share. He was tall, well-dressed for Pell's Crossing, and had the kind of face that made you think he'd been good-looking once and had spent the intervening years trading on that credit. His eyes moved to Samuel first, then to Clara, not with shock or revulsion or the exaggerated sympathy most people produced. He assessed her the way a man assesses a chess piece being moved onto the board, calculating. "Long time," Dalton said to Samuel. "Didn't know they were running a placement service out of Billings these days." Samuel said nothing. His hands remained on the trunk. Dalton's attention shifted back to Clara. Something moved through his expression, not warmth but wearing warmth's clothing. "Ma'am," he said with a small formal tilt of his head, "Marcus Dalton. Welcome to the territory." "Mr. Dalton," Clara said. "I still remember our arrangement, Crawford," Dalton said conversationally, the way you say a thing you want to make sure lands cleanly. "Whenever you're ready to discuss it." Samuel met his eyes. A long, flat, entirely empty look. The kind that contains considerable information delivered without a single word. Then he lifted the trunk onto the pack horse and secured it. "Get your foot in the stirrup," he said to Clara. She had already put her foot in the stirrup. She was already up. He mounted his own horse. They rode out of Pell's Crossing, headed north without another word spoken, and the sound of Dalton watching them go was louder than anything either of them said. They were a good mile up the mountain road before Clara spoke. Her eyes were on the trail ahead. Her voice carried the same even quality it had from the beginning. "You know that man?" "Yes," Samuel said. "From before?" "Yes." The pines closed in on either side of the road. The sky above them was the hard, bright blue of a February afternoon, and the cold had teeth in it. "He was talking to you," Clara said. "But he was watching me." Samuel kept his attention on the trail. "Whatever the arrangement is," she said, "I'd like to know about it." "Not today?" he said. "All right," she said. "Not today." They rode another mile. The mountain got steeper and the trees got thicker, and the light started going long and golden through the branches. Then Clara said, eyes still forward, "You looked at the ground, back there, when I took the scarf down." Samuel's hands were steady on the reins. "I want you to know that I noticed," she said, "and I'll remember." No bitterness in it, no threat. The plain statement of a person recording something true, not for judgment, just because accuracy had been for a long time the only reliable thing she owned. Samuel had nothing to say to that. The wind came down the ridge and moved through the tops of the pines with a sound like something breathing out. They rode the rest of the way without speaking. The cabin appeared when they came over the last rise, a dark shape against the darker tree line, a stone chimney, the woodpile stacked against the east wall, the small barn set back from the main structure at an angle that caught less wind. No light in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. It looked exactly like what it was, a place where a man had been living alone for a very long time and had stopped asking anything of the structure beyond the basic functions of shelter. Samuel brought the horses to a stop at the edge of the clearing. He offered nothing. No apology for it, no attempt to present it as more than it was. He let Clara take it in on its own terms. She sat her horse without moving for a moment. Then she swung down from the saddle without waiting the same ease she'd shown mounting at Pell's Crossing, the efficiency of someone for whom horses had always been practical rather than recreational. She handed Samuel her reins and walked toward the cabin. She stopped at the door, not going in, not hesitating either. She reached out with her right hand and touched the door frame. Her fingers rested against the wood, not testing the structure, not measuring anything. The way you touch something, you're not sure yet whether you have the right to claim. Samuel had tied the horses and was walking up behind her. He caught the gesture and held at the hand on the door frame the particular quality of her stillness and said nothing. After a moment she dropped her hand, lifted the latch, and went in. He followed. Inside the cabin was exactly what you'd expect of a man who lived alone by choice and had made his peace with that long ago. Functional, austere. The particular order that accumulates when a single person has arranged everything to suit one set of hands and one set of habits, and nothing has been moved in years. Pelts on the west wall, traps on their hooks by the door. The stone hearth cold the coals banked from morning. A rough-hewn table with one chair, shelves with mason jars, dried beans, hardtack venison jerky, a cast-iron pan, a tin plate, a tin cup, a skinning board by the back window, the loft ladder in the corner, one chair. Clara stood in the center of the room and took it in. Her eyes moved slowly around the walls, the ceiling, the hearth, the small south window where the last of the afternoon light came through in a narrow band across the floor. They settled finally on the chair. She held her attention there a moment. Then she turned to Samuel. She said nothing about the chair, but something in the angle of her expression said the number had been counted and added to what she already understood about this place and this man. "I'll need a fire," she said. "Where do you keep the kindling?" "Box by the hearth," he said. She went to it. He stood in the doorway, still holding his coat half in and half out, and watched her crouch down and begin building the fire with focused, unhurried competence. The hands of someone who has made fires in unfamiliar hearths in difficult circumstances more times than she'd care to count. He went out to tend the horses. By the time he came back, the fire was going. A real fire, not just caught, but built the kind that would hold for hours. She'd found his pot and had water heating. She was moving across the kitchen side of the room, opening jars, taking stock of what was there. He hung up his coat. She wore her dress underneath plain dark wool, worn but clean mended at the left shoulder, with small, careful stitches stronger than the original seam. Her hair was still pinned. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of doing much with very little. Not a performance of efficiency, just the thing itself, the way it lives in a person who has had to earn every inch of warmth they ever had. She glanced up. "Salt pork or dried venison?" "Either," he said. "Then venison," she said. "Salt pork needs longer." She turned back to the pot. He sat at the table and studied the single chair, then the wall where the second chair wasn't. His eyes moved to the wood stacked by the door. Rough pine boards split ends the offcuts from the last repair he'd done on the barn wall. He sat there with the wood. Then he stopped sitting with it. He got up and went back outside. Clara cooked. The fire built itself up in the hearth the way a good fire does when someone who knows fires has laid it right. The smell of it changed the cabin from cold storage to something with heat in it, something that suggested habitation rather than just occupation. They ate across from each other as the night came down full and cold outside. He ate. She ate. The fire held up its end of the conversation. When she was done, she washed the plates in the basin without being asked. He sat with the fire. "Loft," he said eventually. "You can have the loft. I'll sleep." "The cot in the corner is fine," she said. "That's not—" "It's closer to the fire," she said. "I run cold." He stopped. He thought about pushing back on it. He didn't. She dried her hands on a cloth and went to the cot in the corner and unpacked the top of her trunk with the careful economy of someone who has learned to live in small spaces. A wool blanket, a change of clothes folded flat, a tin of needles and thread placed on the window ledge, 3 small book spines cracked with use set in a row on the shelf he'd cleared. 3 books. He took note of the books. Then he climbed up to the loft. He lay in the dark above her, staring at the underside of the roof he'd built with his own hands 11 years ago, listening to the cabin settle in the cold. And then he heard it. The sound of a page turning. Clara below reading by the light of the fire he'd built, and the fire she'd fed reading in the dark of a strange mountain cabin at the end of a long, hard day that would have broken a smaller person clean in half. Samuel Crawford lay perfectly still and listened to the sound of a page turning, then another, then the soft shift of the cot as she adjusted her position. He had not heard another person's sounds in this cabin for 6 years. He had told himself he preferred it that way. He lay there listening to Clara Bowen read, and he felt something move through him that was not comfort exactly and not dread exactly and not anything with a clean name. Something old, something that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time, waiting to find out if anyone was ever going to come. He didn't sleep for a long while, but when he finally did, it was the deepest sleep he'd had in 6 years. Outside, the wind worked its way down from the ridge and moved through the pine trees with a long, low sound, and the cabin held against it the way it always had. And for the first time in a very long time, there were 2 people inside. He would think about that later when things had gone wrong and the cabin had gone cold again. He would think about that first night and the sound of those pages turning. He would think about how he'd told himself it was just noise, just sound filling a room that had been too quiet too long. But even then, even when he was working hard to believe that he knew better, he'd known better from the very first page. The first week was an education in distance, not the hostile kind, not the kind where 2 people move around each other with the careful deliberateness of a grievance being nursed. It was the other kind, the kind that happens when 2 strangers find themselves sharing a small space and have enough respect for each other to understand that the space needs managing. They developed a geography to it without discussing it. Clara's side of the cabin was the cot, the south window, the shelf with her 3 books, and whatever portion of the hearth she needed to cook. Samuel's side was the loft, the workbench along the north wall, the door. The table was shared territory. They moved around it the way 2 people orbit a campfire, aware of each other, maintaining a comfortable radius, never quite in each other's way. It was not warm between them, but it was not cold in the mean sense of the word. It was 2 people figuring out the rules of a thing neither of them had ever done before, doing it without ceremony. Samuel was up first. Most mornings, the habit of years, the body calibrated to the light. He'd go down and build the fire and put the coffee on and go out to tend the horses and check what the night had left behind. By the time he came back, Clara would be up, and the coffee would be poured, both cups, and whatever was available for breakfast would be on the table or near the fire getting there. The first morning he came back to find his cup poured and waiting, he stopped in the doorway. Clara was at the south window, both hands around her own cup, taking in the snow with the steady attention she turned on most things. She didn't acknowledge his arrival. He sat down and drank his coffee. He didn't say thank you. She didn't look for it. They ate in the kind of silence that is not yet comfortable, but is no longer actively uncomfortable. 2 people who have agreed without words that there is no point in filling air just to fill it. After breakfast on the 3rd day, Samuel went out to the woodpile. He heard the door behind him. He kept splitting. Clara came out without a coat. She'd put on a second wool shirt, the heavy one from her trunk, and walked to the other side of the woodpile and took up the smaller hatchet that leaned against the far log. He registered this without comment. She set up a round of pine and split it cleanly. He turned back to his own work. They split wood for 2 hours without a word between them. The crack of iron on wood, the thud of split logs hitting snow breath coming white in the cold air. She wasn't as powerful as he was. No one was who hadn't spent years at it, but she was efficient in a way that outweighed strength. She understood where to place the blade. She didn't fight the wood. She read the grain the same way he read it, finding the natural line with the wedge and letting the wood do the splitting rather than forcing it. He registered that too. He said nothing about it. When they came back inside, the woodpile was a third larger than it had been. Clara washed her hands in the basin and dried them and went to her shelf for a book. Samuel poured coffee for both of them. He put hers on the edge of the table nearest the cot without turning her direction. She picked it up without turning his. On the 5th day, he came home from the eastern trap line with a cut on his right hand from a spring mechanism that had seized and released wrong. Nothing deep, nothing that needed more than a clean cloth and some pressure. He'd had worse from a dull knife on a cold morning. He went to his kit on the workbench and started looking for the rag he kept there. "Let me see it." He turned. Clara was at his shoulder. She had a folded piece of clean cloth and a small tin of salve that she'd apparently produced from somewhere in that trunk of hers. She wasn't asking exactly, but she wasn't demanding either. It was the tone of someone who has already assessed the situation, knows what needs to happen, and is waiting for the other person to stop being an obstacle. He almost refused. The refusal was right there, the same reflexive closure he applied to anything that involved someone else coming close. But something caught it before it got out. He took in the cloth and the salve and the matter-of-fact steadiness in her face, and the refusal just sat there unused. He held out his hand. She pressed the cloth against the cut with firm, even pressure. No fussing, no wincing on his behalf. She held the cloth until the bleeding slowed, then opened the tin and applied the salve with her thumb, quick, thorough, no wasted movement, and wrapped the cloth around his hand with a clean tie. 2 minutes. The whole thing. Her hands were warm. That was what reached him, and he hadn't expected it, the simple, disorienting warmth of another person's hands after years of his own. He stood with his bandaged hand, and a memory broke the surface before he could stop it. He was on a different mountain. The claim he'd had before this one, further north, smaller, meaner. The winter of Anna's 3rd year. He'd been out on the eastern run, the long trap line, the one that consumed most of a day in good weather. The snow had been building from the northwest all morning, but he'd gone out anyway. He knew this country. He'd been through worse. He hadn't been through that particular storm. It came down like a wall. Not building, arriving suddenly and completely, the sky sealing off and the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour. He turned back immediately, pushed hard. The snow was hip-deep in places and the landmarks were gone, and he navigated by feel and memory the way you do when you've carried a country in your body long enough. He was 4 hours late. He pushed the cabin door open, and the wrong kind of quiet met him. Not the quiet of an empty room. Not the quiet of a woman sleeping. The other kind. The kind that has weight that presses back when you step into it. He'd stood in that doorway and known before he moved, before he crossed the room, before he did the things a man does when he is trying to deny what his body has already understood. He'd stood there a long time, and when he finally stepped inside, the part of him that had stood in the doorway stayed there. It never followed him through. It was still there in some way, leaning against that frame in the dark and the cold, holding what he'd found on the other side. He was in his own cabin. The right one. Fire going, coffee on. The smell of dried herbs and pine smoke and something simple in the cast-iron pot. Clara had stepped back and was closing the tin of salve. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out lower than he'd meant. "You're welcome," she said. She put the tin away, picked up her book, went to the south window. He sat at the table and held his bandaged hand and looked at it. Then he got up and went to the wood stacked by the door. He sorted through the rough pine boards until he found the pieces he needed. He carried them to the workbench. He found his tools. He started building something. He worked by feel, measuring by eye, not by instrument. He worked until the light outside had gone and the fire needed feeding again. He didn't tell her what he was making. She didn't ask. The nights were the hardest part. Not in any way he would have known to expect. He'd thought the adjustment would be the days, the proximity, the shared meals, the constant awareness of another presence in the space. And those things were real. He'd adapted to them faster than expected, with a pragmatism that surprised him. The nights were different. He'd lie in the loft and listen to the small sounds from below, the soft shift of the cot, the occasional murmur of Clara talking herself through something when she thought the room was all hers. He couldn't make out words. He didn't try. He just lay there with the sound of it, a voice running through thoughts in the privacy of what it believed was unobserved, and felt it doing something to the inside of his chest that he couldn't have named if someone had put a blade to him. He'd been alone long enough that human sound at night had stopped registering as an absence. It was just silence, just the shape of a room with one person in it. But now there was sound again, small and human and close, and the part of him that had stopped registering the absence started registering the presence, and he didn't know what to do with the difference. He'd stare at the underside of the roof he'd built and tell himself to sleep. He'd hear another page turn. He did not sleep particularly well those first weeks, but he slept better than he had in years, which was its own kind of unsettling. He saw her writing for the first time on the 8th night. He'd come down from the loft past midnight for water, moving in the dark, the way he always moved in it, not sneaking, just careful by habit. The fire had burned down to deep red coals, and there was a single candle going on the table. Clara was sitting at the table with a small notebook open in front of her, a pencil in her hand. She raised her eyes when he came down the ladder. She didn't startle. Neither of them spoke. He crossed to the water bucket, drank, set the cup down. In the candlelight, she'd let her hair down from its pins. It fell past her shoulders in a way he hadn't seen before. The left side of her face, the scarred side, was turned toward the candle, and the light moved across the scar tissue in a way that made it look less like damage and more like something carved, something with its own architecture. He became aware that he was staring. He redirected his attention to the water bucket. "Go back to sleep," she said, not unkindly. He went back up the ladder. He lay in the dark and thought about what someone like Clara Bowen might write in a notebook at midnight in a cabin on a mountain in Montana. He turned it over, arrived at nothing, put it down. He would find out eventually. But not yet. The chair was done on the 11th day. He finished it late in the afternoon while Clara was outside gathering snow for water. He carried it to the hearth and set it in the spot she naturally drifted toward the south side of the fire, where the light came best through the window and the warmth hit most directly. He positioned it at the angle that would catch both. He was at the table when she came back in with the snow-filled pot. She set the pot on the fire, turned. She went still. The chair was solid pine hand-planed pegged rather than nailed with a straight back and arms at a height that suited a person who sat with a book the way she sat with a book. Elbows on the rests, spine straight but not rigid. It was exactly the right height, exactly the right depth. She crossed to it slowly. She ran her right hand along the near armrest, once testing whether it was a thing she was allowed to trust. Then she sat down. It fit. "You didn't measure," she said. "No," he said. "Then how?" "Doesn't matter," he said. He was studying his coffee. She held the question a moment longer. Then she set it aside. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a chair," he said. She turned back to the fire. "Yes," she said. "It is." But she ran her hand along the armrest again before she reached for her book. And later, up in the loft, he could hear that the small sounds from below were coming from a different place in the room, from the chair. He lay in the dark and felt something shift, not in his chest, but in his understanding of the room, in the architecture of the cabin itself. A person had moved from a cot in a corner to a chair by the fire, and he had made that possible, and that meant something he wasn't ready to put into language. He told himself it was just a chair. He was, as has been noted, not always honest with himself. 3 weeks in, they rode down to Pell's Crossing for supplies. Clara put her scarf on before they left the cabin, the one she'd unwound at the stage stop that first day. She put it on without comment, without ceremony, and Samuel registered it but said nothing, because it was not his face and not his decision, and he understood enough about the economics of self-protection to know that you pick your battles based on the cost of losing. Pell's Crossing was never a town that welcomed strangers gracefully, and Clara Bowen was in the particular arithmetic of that place and time a certain kind of stranger. She was a mail-order bride with a scar on her face arriving in the company of a man who lived alone on a mountain and was generally regarded by the settlement as somewhere between a curiosity and a cautionary tale. The settlement had opinions about that combination. Samuel understood the opinions before they arrived. He understood the way conversation found lower registers as they tied up outside the post, and the way Jed Pell's eyes moved once to Clara's face, and then with great deliberate performance did not move there again. He understood Mrs. Hartwell, the wife of the traveling preacher who passed through Pell's Crossing 3 times a year and left his wife there between visits like baggage he'd run out of room for. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of profound charitable instincts that expressed themselves most freely at other people's expense. She materialized near the fabric bolts before Clara had been inside the post 30 seconds. "Mrs. Crawford, I presume? What a journey you must have had. We've all been so curious." The pause before curious did considerable work. "You must let me know if there's anything you need. Anything at all. We look after each other out here." Clara was examining a bolt of heavy wool with the focused interest of someone who knows exactly what she's looking at. She didn't glance up. "That's very kind," she said. "Thank you." Of course. Such a situation. But then that's the frontier, isn't it? We make do." Clara set down the bolt. She turned and met Mrs. Hartwell's eyes directly, not with warmth, not with hostility, just with the full-level attention that was Clara's particular way of telling a person they had been seen accurately. "Yes," she said, "we do." Something in that gaze made Mrs. Hartwell remember somewhere else she needed to be. She drifted toward the far end of the post with the slightly accelerated movement of a person who has decided the current conversation is over but wants to appear to have ended it on her own terms. Samuel had been across the room watching. He felt something in his chest, not pride exactly, something that lived in the same neighborhood, the particular sensation of watching someone handle a difficult thing with the kind of economy and precision you've spent your whole life trying to achieve yourself. He carried the flour bags to the counter. They were almost loaded and ready to leave when Dalton came out of the trading post behind them. He came to Samuel, not to Clara. That was the thing that registered the careful, deliberate choice of it. Crawford. Dalton's voice was easy, conversational, the voice of a man who has decided patience is the most effective weapon available. Don't suppose you've given any more thought to our outstanding business. There's no outstanding business, Samuel said. He was securing the last bag on the pack horse. Well, Dalton's tone was pleasant in the manner of something sharp wearing soft cover. That's one way to see it. Samuel finished the knot. He turned and faced Dalton. 3 seconds. A look that contained a considerable amount of information delivered without any words at all. Dalton held it. He was not a man easily held down, and he didn't drop his eyes first, but he didn't push further either. His attention shifted to Clara, not the calculating assessment from the stage stop. Something different this time. Something that saw in her presence here a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, a small, correctly formal nod. "Mr. Dalton," she said. He went back inside. Samuel mounted his horse. Clara mounted hers. They rode out of Pell's Crossing, heading north, and the cold came in around them as the tree line closed over the road. They were a mile up the mountain before Clara spoke. "He was talking to you," she said, "but he was watching me." "Yes," Samuel said, "like I'm relevant to whatever the two of you have between you." "Don't think about Dalton," Samuel said. Her jaw had the set of someone exercising considerable restraint in the direction of not saying something. "I find it easier not to think about things I understand," she said. "The ones I don't understand are harder to put down." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "There's a piece of paper," he said. "An old arrangement. It has to do with the land." She waited. "It's from before you came, before Anna. From when I first came up here and Dalton we had a business of sorts. For a time." He stopped. "It doesn't affect you. You said there's no outstanding business." "I said that." "Was that true?" He was quiet too long, long enough that the question answered itself. Clara's eyes stayed on the ridge ahead. The last of the afternoon light was going fast, the cold coming on sharp and clean. "When you're ready to tell me the whole of it," she said, "I'll be there. No resentment in it, no ultimatum. Just a piece of information offered for the record." He glanced at her. She was on the trail, her profile clean and composed against the dark trees. He turned back to the road. He should have told her then. He didn't. The blizzard came on a Wednesday. Samuel read it in the sky 2 days before the particular bruised color of a heavy front moving in from the northwest. The ravens flying lower and faster than usual, the quality of the cold that had started to feel less like weather and more like intention. He spent Tuesday cutting extra wood and checking the barn, moving through preparations with the efficiency of a man who has been caught underprepared by a Montana winter before and decided never to repeat the experience. Clara worked alongside him without being asked. She had figured out within the first 2 weeks which tasks she could manage alone and which ones moved faster with 2 people, and she approached both categories with equal practicality. By Tuesday evening the cabin was provisioned for 10 days. The horses were in the barn with extra hay and a windbreak on the north side, and there were enough dry rounds stacked by the door to last through the worst of it. They ate dinner as the first gusts hit the walls. By midnight it was a full storm. By morning the world outside was white in every direction. The first day they managed with the careful politeness that had become their default. Clara read. Samuel repaired a trap mechanism that had been giving him trouble since October. The storm pressed on the walls and the windows and the door, and the fire answered it, and they moved around each other in the small space with the practiced ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms without meaning to. The second day was harder. There is a particular confinement that comes from being inside with another person during a bad storm when there is nowhere to go, and the wind has been saying the same thing for 36 hours, and the space that felt adequate 2 days ago has developed opinions. They were both keenly aware of each other in a way that the busyness of ordinary days allowed them to manage. In the confinement of the storm, there was no managing it. It was simply present. Samuel found himself registering things he'd been successfully not registering. The way she read slowly with full attention, sometimes going back over a passage 2 or 3 times, her lips moving slightly on sentences she was tasting rather than just consuming. She laughed once quietly to herself over something on the page, a low, soft sound of genuine amusement that she cut off when she realized the room was quiet enough that it carried. She raised her eyes and found him watching her. The laugh died. She went back to the book. He turned his attention to the trap mechanism in his hands. He'd taken that from her. That small, private moment of being delighted by something. His timing had been wrong, and she'd closed it off the way you shut a shutter against a draft. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Midnight on the second night was when the storm delivered its worst. Samuel woke to a sound he'd been hearing without fully registering something from the barn. A rhythmic distress signal repeated, escalating. He was down the loft ladder and into his coat and out the door before he'd fully decided to move, operating on the instinct of a man who has learned to trust his body's alarm systems above his own reasoning. The wind hit him like a wall, and the snow was driving horizontal, and the 20 yards between the cabin and the barn took considerably longer than they should have. The barn door was shaking against its latch, and inside was chaos, the smell of panic, the sound of a horse hitting the wall of its stall with the flat of her leg, repeated and desperate. His roan, the old one, the one that had been with him 6 years, was down in the corner of her stall with her right foreleg extended wrong. She'd caught it somehow. The stall board maybe, or the loose nail he'd been meaning to fix since fall. Something had gotten hold of her leg and she'd panicked, and the angle was wrong. He needed a second set of hands. The barn door opened behind him. Clara came in out of the storm in her coat and boots. With the barn lantern from just inside the door, she'd grabbed it on the way through. One fast read of the situation. "Her head," she said. "Yes," he said. "Talk to her. Keep her talking." She went to the roan's head and got down in the straw and put both hands on the horse's neck and started low, continuous, unhurried. Not comforting exactly. Something more specific than comfort. Something that said, "I am here, and I am not afraid, and you don't need to be either." The roan's breathing started coming slower. Not calm, but slower. Samuel worked the leg free from where it had wedged between the lower board and the stall floor. The angle resolved. He ran his hands down the leg, checking, feeling for damage. A bad scrape deep in one place, some swelling starting, not broken. He cleaned the wound, dressed it with what he had in the barn kit, wrapped it tight. The roan kept trying to rise, and Clara kept her down with voice and hands until he was finished and gave the signal. They got her up. She stood, weight on all 4 legs, favoring the right front, but standing. Samuel let out a breath he'd been holding for 20 minutes. He became aware that he was kneeling in the straw, with Clara kneeling on the other side of the horse, one hand still on the roan's neck, both of them breathing hard from the cold and the work, the lantern throwing warm orange light over all of it. He raised his eyes. She was already looking at him. Her hair had come half loose in the hurry of getting out here. Her face was flushed from the cold. The scar on her left side caught the lantern light the same way the cabin candle had caught it that night, not concealing it, not obscuring it, just making it part of the full picture of her face, the same way her jaw was part of the picture and her eyes were part of the picture. He took her in, and he did not search for the scar. He simply saw her. The woman who had come out of a warm cabin into a blizzard at midnight because she'd heard him go and understood, without being told, that a second pair of hands was needed. Who had known exactly what to do without instruction. Who had gotten down in the straw in her only good coat and talked a frightened horse through it with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to every difficult thing. The scar was not what he was looking at. He was looking at Clara Bowen kneeling in the straw in his barn in the middle of a Montana blizzard, meeting his eyes with those level dark eyes, asking for nothing, waiting for nothing, simply and completely present. A lock turned somewhere deep in him. Not opened, not yet, but turned, the mechanism engaging for the first time in a very long time, registering the possibility of a different position. She felt the change in the moment. She didn't know what she'd expected when she'd gotten up and grabbed the lantern and come out into the storm. Hard work in difficult conditions, that was what the sounds from the barn had promised, and she was not a person who walked away from work or conditions. She had not expected this. She had been studied in many ways across her whole life. She carried an internal catalog of them, the horror look, the pity look, the careful not to look, the I'm being very progressive about this look. She knew the look that went straight to the scar and got stuck. She knew the look that tried very hard to go everywhere else and also got stuck. She did not know this one. This was simply looking, as if she were a person, and he were looking at the person, and the scar occupied the same category of information as the color of her coat or the way she'd pinned her hair that morning. Present, factual, not the whole of the picture. She had been 12 years old the last time someone had looked at her that way. The memory arrived fast and uninvited the way the ones from that age always did. The small room in her aunt's house the summer after the fire, the window with the white curtain. Her aunt had set a small mirror on the washstand one morning and left quickly in the manner of someone depositing something they'd rather not see used. Clara had sat on the edge of the narrow bed and studied that mirror from across the room for a long time. She was 12, old enough to understand what looking into it would confirm and what that confirmation would mean for the rest of her life. She sat there a long time. Then she crossed the room and looked. She studied it the way you study a map of territory you're going to have to live in, noting the landmarks, the boundaries, the topography of the damage. Then she nodded, once to herself in the glass. All right, she'd thought, not out loud, just a thought, but clean and clear as anything she'd ever had. This is the face. This is the one I have. Everything from here is from here. She had not cried. She hadn't cried since the night of the fire itself, when the crying was involuntary and had nothing to do with choice. She had put the mirror face down on the washstand and gone out to help her aunt with dinner. That was the last time anyone had looked at her the way Samuel Crawford looked at her in the lantern light of that barn, directly without an agenda in the looking. She felt something begin very quietly, very carefully to loosen. She had been gripping something for 17 years the way you grip a rope on a steep slope, because the grip is the only thing between you and the fall. You hold it so long and so hard that the grip stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the natural position of your hands. You forget that solid ground exists. You forget that letting go of the rope doesn't have to mean the fall. She did not let go. But for the first time in 17 years, she felt the possibility of it. That was enough. For now, that was more than she'd had in a long time. They came back to the cabin wet and cold and quieter than they'd left. Samuel put more wood on the fire. Clara heated water. They changed out of the wet outer layers separately with the observance of the unspoken rules they'd established, and came back to the fire with dry wool and the particular ease that follows hard physical work. Clara made coffee. Real coffee, the good kind she'd been rationing. She handed him a cup. He took it. They sat her in her chair, him on the stool he'd pulled close, and drank while the storm exhausted itself against the walls. After a while she opened her book. She read a passage aloud, not asking permission, not performing, just reading the way she did sometimes when she found something she wanted to put into the air of the room. "We are all of us the walking wounded," he said to her. "The question is not how we were wounded, but whether we learned to walk." She turned the page. Samuel held his coffee cup in both hands and stared at the fire. The storm pressed on. The fire held. He said nothing. But he didn't go up to the loft. He sat there and she read, and the hours moved the way good hours move, with weight and warmth and the quality of time that you know even while you're inside it you'll want back someday. Sometime past 2 in the morning she fell asleep in the chair, the book open in her lap, her head tilted against the chair back, her face in full repose, both sides of it, the smooth and the scarred, equally still, equally hers. He got up. He took the blanket from the cot in the corner. He crossed to the chair and laid it over her, not carrying her, not moving her, just covering her against the cold the way you cover something that matters. His hands were steady. He stood in the firelight above her sleeping face and held the moment, couldn't have measured it in seconds. Then he went back to the stool, sat down, and stayed until morning came. The third day of the blizzard arrived with the flat gray calm that means a storm has made its point and is prepared to release you. The wind died by noon. By mid-afternoon there was pale winter light coming through the south window and falling across the floor in a way that felt, after 3 days of howling dark, like the most generous thing the mountain had offered in weeks. Clara was awake when Samuel came in from checking the horse. Food was on the fire. The cabin smelled like coffee and pine smoke and the particular warmth of a place that has been kept alive through something difficult. He stood inside the door. She raised her eyes from the pot. The storm had changed them, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. But the distance was different, less like a boundary, more like a space two people had come to stand in together and were slowly learning what to do with the proximity. She ladled food into bowls and set one in front of him. She sat in her chair. He sat in his. They ate. Outside, the snow lay deep and undisturbed in every direction, and the sky above the ridge was clearing to the cold blue of a Montana winter afternoon, and the pines stood dark against the white like they'd been there since before any of this started, and intended to be there long after. "Thank you," Samuel said. "For the barn, last night." "It needed doing," she said. "I know, still." She met his eyes. "You're welcome." He turned to his bowl. She turned to hers. The fire held its steady commentary. From outside a raven called once and was answered once, and then the mountain went back to its business. Samuel became aware in the particular way that certain realizations arrive not with force, but with inevitability, that the prospect of Clara not being here had begun to feel like the prospect of the fire going out. He didn't examine the thought. He put it where he put everything. He wasn't ready to look at somewhere interior in the dark, where things waited for him to become ready. He wasn't ready. But the thought was there now. And some thoughts, once they've arrived, do not go back to being unthought. The week after the blizzard, Holt came by on a clear, cold morning. He came in, took off his coat, accepted coffee, and sat at the table in the way of a man who has visited a place so many times he doesn't need to orient himself. His eyes moved around the cabin, the rug by the door, the rearranged shelves, the second chair, the herbs on the rafter beam, the south window that had had a torn piece of oilskin over it since 2 winters ago, and now had a properly mended piece of heavy wool that kept the draft out and still let in light. He took all of it in. Samuel came back from checking the pack horse and sat down with his coffee. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Holt said, "You know you haven't checked the eastern trap line in 2 weeks." "I know," Samuel said. "Before this you never let it go more than 3 days." "I know that too." Holt turned his cup. "I've known you 6 years, Crawford. You have never left a trap line 2 weeks." Samuel drank his coffee. "You're different," Holt said. "Am I?" "Yes." "Good or bad?" Holt was genuinely quiet with the question, not performing consideration, actually holding it. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but different." He finished his coffee, stood up, put on his coat, and left. Samuel sat at the table after he'd gone. Through the south window he could make out the far edge of the clearing where the pines started and the mountain went on up into the gray sky. He could see the place on the trail where Clara came back from the creek each morning. He sat there long enough that the coffee went cold. Then he got up and went to get his coat. The eastern trap line wasn't going to check itself, but his feet carried him briefly to the shelf where Clara kept her 3 books, not to take one, not to look at anything specific, just to stand in that part of the room for a moment. Then he shook his head at himself one short, hard motion and went out the door. The cold hit him clean and clear, and he stood in the yard and took in the mountain and then the cabin with its thin line of smoke rising into the flat white sky. He turned north toward the trap line. He walked into the trees. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The picture of it was already there, completely formed, settled into a place inside him where things that matter take up residence without asking permission. The smoke, the window with the light, the second chair visible through the glass. Home was a word he had not let himself use in a very long time. He pushed it away. but it followed him a long way into the trees before it finally let him alone. Spring came to the Montana high country the way it always does. Not with the gentle arrival that people in softer climates expect from the season, but reluctantly, incrementally, like a man who has agreed to show up but hasn't decided yet how long he'll stay. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, first leaving behind mud and exposed rock and the brown matted grass of last year pressing up against the new green trying to come through. The creek ran high and cold with meltwater. The pines dripped for days after the last storm, and the world smelled like wet earth and pine sap and the particular clean sharpness of a country waking up from a long freeze. Samuel noticed the season changing, the way he always noticed it through the behavior of animals, the quality of light, the shift in wind direction. He noticed it differently this year because there was someone to notice it with, not in the sense that they talked about it much. But Clara would stop sometimes in the cabin doorway in the morning with her coffee and take in the clearing as the light changed, and Samuel would come up behind her on his way to the barn and stop too, and they'd both stand there looking at the same thing, and that shared looking was its own kind of conversation. He'd learned her rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of a piece of country you live in, not by studying them deliberately, but by moving through them long enough that they became part of your internal map. He knew she was up before full light. He knew she didn't speak until she'd had her first cup of coffee, and he had stopped trying before then. He knew she hummed when she was working at something she found satisfying, a low, almost unconscious sound, a tune he didn't recognize that might not have had a name, just the sound of a person who was in that moment all right. He had caught himself listening for that sound. He was not ready to examine what that meant. What he was ready to do, what he found himself doing. More in those early spring weeks was register the changes Clara had made to the cabin, not tallying them as evidence of anything, just acknowledging them. The rug by the door, the herbs on the rafter, the shelves rearranged so that the things used every day were at the front, and the things used occasionally were behind practical and obvious, and something he'd never thought to do in 11 years. The second chair. He would stand at the table sometimes when she wasn't in it, and feel the weight of that chair, the specific gravity of an object made for a particular person that knows it. He was, in the language of the frontier, in trouble. He did not act on it. He was very good at not acting on things. On a Tuesday in the third week of April, Samuel went out on the eastern trap line. A full day's work, the long loop that took him north along the creek drainage and then back along the higher ridge, 12 miles total in good conditions. He left at first light and expected to be back before dark. The traps were in better shape than he'd expected. He reset 4 pulled 2 that had been sprung by animals too small to be worth the effort, checked the water sets along the creek. By early afternoon he'd covered the northern half of the loop and was heading back along the ridge when the weather shifted, not dangerously, but the wind came up cold and the sky put on that shade of pewter that meant rain before dark. He pushed the pace back. He was still a mile from the cabin when the rain started. He smelled smoke before he came over the rise, the cabin fire, which was normal. But there was something else. A second horse smell from the direction of the clearing saddle leather mixed with an animal he didn't own. He knew that combination. Samuel stood at the tree line and studied the yard below. One set of fresh hoof prints in the mud, coming and going. A big horse well shod. He knew the shoe pattern without needing to get closer. He went inside. Clara was at the table. She was not reading. She was not cooking. She sat with her hands flat on the wood and an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not distress, not anger, not anything that simple. The expression of a person who has received information they are still in the process of sorting, who has not yet decided what the sorting will cost them. On the porch railing when he'd come in, he'd seen something. An envelope, white sealed, placed there with the deliberateness of something left on purpose. He hadn't touched it. He stood inside the door and let the rain drip off his coat. "Dalton was here," he said. "Yes," she said. He waited. He made an offer. She kept her eyes on her hands. The kind with money in an envelope. He left it on the porch. I didn't take it. But I didn't throw it away either, and I want you to know that. He stood just inside the door with the rain on his coat and the cold coming in behind him. "What did he say to you?" Samuel's voice came out flat past anger into the territory where anger has been compressed into something denser. He said you were ashamed of the situation, that you didn't know how to tell me to go without hurting me further, that the money would make it easier for everyone. He said I was ashamed. Yes. Of you. That was the implication. The rain hit the cabin roof in a steady drum. The fire popped once. Everything else held its breath. He also said something about the land, Clara said. Her voice had the particular careful quality of someone handling something fragile they know is also important. He said I should ask you about the paper you carry in your inside pocket. He said once I knew what was in it, I'd understand why you sent for a wife in the first place. Samuel didn't move. And then he rode away, she finished. And I've been sitting here since trying to decide whether I was angry or just tired. Which is it? She held the question at arm's length, actually weighing it. Both, she said, but the tired is older. He crossed to the fire and stood with his back to it, not for warmth but for something solid to organize against. He took off his wet coat. He ran his hand along the back of his neck. Leave the envelope on the porch, he said. Don't touch it. I already told you I didn't. I know. I'm saying leave it there. Samuel, he met her eyes. I'm not asking you to explain Dalton, she said. I don't care about Dalton. I'm asking you to explain the paper. He was quiet. I've been here 11 weeks, she said. I've done the work I said I would do. I haven't asked you for things you didn't offer, but I think I have the right to understand what I walked into, what this arrangement actually is. She said it without heat, without accusation. Just here is what I need, and here is why I need it, and I am asking directly because that is the only way I know how to ask. He stared at the fire. Then he told her. He told her about Dalton, the part that mattered. The land, the arrangement 12 years old and never written into anything legally binding because Samuel had been 26 and new to the territory, and Dalton had offered a handshake, and Samuel had been fool enough to take it as sufficient. The terms were simple. If Samuel built a viable homestead on the Northern Ridge parcel and established a lawful claim with a household with a legal heir within 10 years, the land was his. If not, the parcel reverted to Dalton's control. He'd had 9 years when Anna died. He'd had 8 years left when he sent the letter to the agency in Billings. He told her this plainly in the tone he'd used to describe the condition of a trapline. Factual, no softening. When he finished, Clara had her eyes on the table. So, she said, I'm the legal claim. You're my wife? He said. I'm the legal claim, she said again, precisely. Clara, I'm not angry. She raised her eyes to his. I want to be accurate. There are 2 reasons you sent that letter. One was the land. One was... She stopped. What was the second one? I told you, I needed someone in the cabin. The silence had gotten... Tell me plainly, she said. Tell me what you actually needed. He met her gaze, the fire between them, the rain on the roof, the long pause of a man searching for words in a language he'd stopped speaking years ago. I needed to hear another person in the rooms, he said. Another person's sounds. I needed to wake up and know someone else was breathing in the cabin. Did you need me? She said. Or did you need a body to put in this room? The question landed clean and without cruelty. The truth of it set down in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. He opened his mouth. He had the answer. He knew he had it fully formed, completely true, waiting to be spoken. The barn at midnight. The lantern light. Her voice talking the roan through her fear. The sound of pages turning in the dark. The chair he'd built without measuring. All of it right there. And from somewhere deep in the locked part of himself, from the part that had been standing in that other doorway for 6 years, the part that believed letting someone close was the same as setting them up to be taken. The fear answered before he could. I needed someone for the land, he said, and I needed someone for the silence. Both of those things were real. He watched her face receive those words. He watched her understand the order he'd put them in. I see, she said. Her voice had not changed. That was the worst of it. She wasn't wounded in any visible way. No tears, no flinching, no withdrawal. She simply received the information, and something in her expression completed a calculation she'd apparently been running for weeks, and she became very slightly more still. Clara, no, flat, final. You answered the question I asked. The land came first. That's useful to know. That's not what I meant. It's what you said. It's not the whole of it. Samuel. Her voice dropped to something quieter and more absolute. I have been very careful this whole time not to require things from you that you didn't offer. I think that's been the right call. But I need to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, and I need you to understand that the answer is going to determine something. He went completely still. Do you see me as a person, she said, or as a solution to two problems? The fire, the rain, the whole weight of 11 weeks pressing into the silence between them, the chair and the coffee and the barn and the pages turning, and the word he'd been pushing away into the trees. He opened his mouth. And the locked part of him, the part in the doorway, the part that had watched Anna go still and silent, and had decided in that moment that this was the cost of loving things, that this was what you invited when you let people matter. That part held the door shut one more time. He said nothing. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Good night, Samuel," she said. She went to her cot. He stood by the fire until well past midnight. Once very late he thought he heard the smallest sound from the corner where her cot was, the kind a person makes when they are working very hard not to make any sound at all. He put more wood on the fire. He stared at it until it had nothing left to tell him. She was up before him in the morning. He heard the sounds from below, different from the usual. Controlled, deliberate. The sounds of someone who has made a decision and is moving through it. He came down the ladder, and she was at the cot, stripped of its blanket. Her trunk was open on the floor. She was folding things. She didn't raise her eyes. "Clara, I'm going to need the pack horse as far as Pell's Crossing," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "I can arrange my own transportation from there. Don't do this." "I'm not doing anything dramatic," she said. "I'm being practical. The arrangement isn't working. That's not an accusation. It's an assessment." "The arrangement is—" "I'm not a land claim," she said, still folding. "I understand that you needed one. I understand that you also needed something else that's harder to name. But I am not able to keep living in this cabin and not know which one I am to you, and last night you answered that question." "I answered it wrong." She stopped folding. She turned to him. He met her eyes. "I answered it wrong," he said again. "The order I put those words in that wasn't Samuel. Quiet. Don't. Clara. Don't tell me you answered wrong if you can't tell me what the right answer is." He stood there. He had the right answer. He knew he had it same as last night, right there, fully formed, completely true. The locked part of him held it in one hand and held the door shut with the other. He said nothing. Clara turned back to the trunk. "I'll be ready by first light tomorrow," she said. "I won't ask you to come down. I know the road." He walked to the barn. He stayed there a long time. She left at dawn. He was in the loft. He'd gone up in the night not to sleep, but because he couldn't stand in the room any longer, and there was nowhere else to be in a cabin this size. He lay on his back and listened to the last hour, the small, careful sounds of a person leaving and doing it without ceremony. A trunk closing. Latches clicked. Boots on the floor, deliberate. The fire banked. She banked it before she left because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who tends to things even when she's walking away from them. The door. He lay still. He heard her crossing the yard. The pack horse, he'd left it hitched and ready the night before, unable to determine whether this was acceptance or just failure to prevent the inevitable. The sound of hooves on the frozen mud of the yard. Going south, going away. He lay in the dark and listened to the hoofbeats until the pines swallowed them, and then there was nothing but the wind and the fire settling and the complete and particular silence of a place that has had a person in it and now does not. He lay there a long time. The cabin told the story of her absence immediately. He came down the ladder in the thin morning light and the air was different. Not colder, she'd banked the fire, well, it was warm enough. But warmth without someone in it is a different thing from warmth with someone. He had forgotten that in 6 years of living alone, or told himself he had, and the cabin reminded him the moment he stepped off the last rung. The cot in the corner, stripped bare. The shelf where her 3 books had been, empty. The south windowsill where she'd kept her tin of needles and thread, gone. The chair was still there. It sat in its place by the fire where he'd set it, and she'd sat in it every day for 11 weeks, and it was empty now and would stay empty, and he'd built it to fit a specific person, and that person had taken the road south. He'd told himself it was just a chair when he built it. He stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at it. He went outside and split wood for 3 hours. The days that followed had a familiar shape and an unfamiliar weight. He knew how to live alone. He'd done it for 6 years before she came, and he knew every detail of it. The single plate, the single cup, the meals cooked for one, the evenings without sound. He'd made his peace with it, or told himself he had. The problem was that he'd made his peace with absence. He had not made peace with the specific absence of Clara Bowen. Those are different things. Absence as a general condition is livable. You organize yourself around it the same way you organize yourself around cold weather. You compensate, you adapt. You stop expecting what you've stopped having. You build a life that doesn't require the thing you don't have. But the absence of one particular person who filled a particular space in a particular way, that is a wound. And wounds do not respond to the same strategies as weather. He sat at the table and ate his meals, and the chair sat across from him, and he kept his eyes off it. He went out on the trap lines and came home to a cabin with one light in the window, the lamp he left burning, and the sight of that single light where there had been 2 felt like an accusation he had no defense against. On the 3rd day, he found her notebook. He hadn't known she'd left it. It sat on the shelf behind where her books had been, not visible, tucked back as if it had slipped behind the larger volumes and been overlooked, or as if she had left it on purpose and arranged it so the leaving could be read either way. He held it in his hands before he opened it. The entries were not what he'd imagined. There was no narrative, no long interior confession, more like a collection passages from her books, copied out in small, careful handwriting sentences she'd wanted to keep. Interleaved with these at irregular intervals were short observations, a sentence or 2, no date, no address. He built up the fire this morning while I was still asleep. I don't think he knows I heard him. He counts the jars in the pantry every week. I don't think he knows I've noticed. He has been alone so long that kindness comes out of him sideways, like water finding its way through stone. I think he is learning how to want to stay. I just don't know if he'll learn it in time. Samuel put the notebook down on the table. He sat with his hands flat on either side of it and stared at the wall. In time. She had known. She had seen it, all of it from the beginning, more clearly than he had seen it himself. She had sat in that chair with those level dark eyes and written it down in small, careful words. He is learning how to want to stay. And he had let her ride down that mountain. Moses arrived on the 6th day. He came in without knocking. Moses never knocked and swept the cabin with one glance, taking in the stripped cot and the bare shelf and the empty chair, and sat down and began making coffee without being invited. Samuel was at the workbench. He put down what he was doing. He sat at the table. Moses set 2 cups down. He sat across and drank without questions for a while. Then he said, "Tell me," Samuel told him. The whole of it. The question Clara had asked, the order he'd put the words in, the way she'd received it, the trunk, the dawn departure. Moses listened without interrupting. He turned his cup in his hands when Samuel was done. His eyes moved to the empty shelf where her books had been. "There's something else you should know," Moses said. "Something I should have told you sooner." Samuel held his eyes. "Dalton has a lawyer in Billings," Moses said. "Has had one for about 2 months. The man has been building an abandoned property case against this parcel, no legal heir, no household intermittent occupancy. If Clara leaves and doesn't come back before September, Dalton has grounds. The lawyer's already drawn up the papers." Samuel's hands went flat on the table. "He knew about the letter you sent to the agency," Samuel said. "Found out somehow. Pell's Crossing is not a town of secrets." Moses paused. "He's been waiting. He let her come, he watched how it was going, and when he saw it was going, he moved. Came to the cabin when you were out, made his offer. She told me about the offer. Then you know." Moses drank his coffee. The money wasn't Charity Crawford. It was the cleanest way to win without a court fight. Samuel stared at the table. The anger in him had a different address from where it usually lived, not toward Dalton, not outward. It pointed inward at the exact moment he'd stood by the fire and said the wrong words in the wrong order and watched her face close like a shutter. "That's why I need to ask you something," Moses said. His voice had changed quieter, older. "And I need you to answer it honestly. Ask. When you go after her, and I'm not asking if you're going to because you're going to, we both know that when you go after her, is it for the land or is it for her?" The question sat between them. Samuel's eyes moved to the empty chair. "Last night," Moses said into the quiet, "I asked myself what kind of fool watches a woman like that ride away from him and doesn't move. And then I remembered you've done it before." Samuel raised his eyes. "Anna," Moses said, "the night she was dying. You weren't there." The word landed the way Moses had intended, not as a weapon, but as the kind of truth that has been waiting too long to be said with any gentleness left in it. "I know," Samuel said. His voice had the flatness of something said too many times in an interior conversation and worn smooth. "What you don't know," Moses said, "is what I know. Henry Marsh was at Pell's Crossing the night you went into that storm. He was at the post office when you came through pushing south in weather that should have killed a man trying to get to the settlement to find a midwife." He paused. "He saw you go, Samuel. He watched you walk into that blizzard." Samuel went absolutely still. "You didn't stand in the cabin and do nothing," Moses said. "You went. You went into a storm that turned that whole road into a white hell, and you couldn't get back in time. That is a different thing from what you've been telling yourself for 6 years. "Henry never said anything," Samuel said. "You never came back to a place where it could be said." Samuel put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He sat there. Moses let him sit. He was at the grave. Not in memory, only in the way that certain places exist simultaneously in the past and in the interior of the people who carry them. He was there on the day of the burial, snow coming down clean and fine, everyone else already gone back down the mountain, standing alone in the cold with the freshly turned earth in front of him. He'd stood there until his feet went numb. Then he'd kneeled. He hadn't thought about what he was going to say. It came out of him raw and plain with no audience to perform for. "I wasn't there," he'd said. "I should have been. I should have stayed. I'll carry that." He'd pressed his hand flat against the cold ground. "I won't let this happen again," he'd said. "I won't let myself. I won't bring anyone else into this, into the mountain and the winter and the things that can go wrong. I won't put anyone else in that position. This is the line." He'd meant it as protection. He had not understood kneeling in the snow over Anna's grave that he was protecting himself, that what he called a promise was a wall, that what he called sacrifice was the most efficient form of cowardice available to a man of his temperament, one that came dressed in the language of virtue and could be maintained indefinitely without anyone knowing the difference, not even himself. He stood up from the grave in his memory and faced the mountain, and what he saw with all of it laid out before him was not a man making a noble choice. He saw a man who was frightened, a man who had loved someone and lost her and decided the losing was the cost of the loving, and that the only way to avoid the cost was to stop loving anything, who had then spent 6 years perfecting that avoidance, and who had very nearly completed the work. Until a woman stepped off a stagecoach and pulled a scarf from her face and met his eyes without asking him for a single thing. He came back to the cabin. Moses was waiting. "I've been carrying the wrong version of that night," Samuel said. "For 6 years. "Yes," Moses said. "I told myself I was keeping a promise." "You were keeping yourself safe," Moses said, "which is a different thing." Samuel kept his eyes on the empty chair for a long time. "She wrote something in that notebook," he said. "She said she thought I was learning how to want to stay." Moses said nothing. "She was right," Samuel said. "I was learning it. And then she asked me the one question that mattered, and I answered it wrong because I was afraid, and now she's on a road south in the mud with her one trunk, and I'm up here talking to you about it." "That's approximately correct," Moses said. "So what do I do with that?" Moses held him in a long, straight look, the look of a man who has been waiting for the right question to be asked and intends to make the answer count. "You know what you do with it," he said. He went to the grave first. He hadn't planned to. He was saddling the roan who was walking sound again, whose leg had healed clean under Clara's handling in the barn, and he found himself turning north instead of south toward the small clearing on the ridge where he'd buried Anna 6 winters ago. The grave was simple, a stone marker hand-cut with her name and the year. He'd planted a juniper on the east side the spring after, because she'd liked juniper, and it had grown into a proper tree, dark green against the gray rock, healthy and settled in the way of trees that find the right spot and hold it. He stood in front of the stone. "I've been using you," he said. "I've been using what happened to you as a wall, and I told myself it was for you that I was honoring you. But I was honoring my own fear and calling it something better." The juniper moved in a small wind. "She's not you," he said. "She's someone else entirely. Someone I didn't know existed before 2 months ago. The cabin is wrong without her. And I know the difference between lonely and wrong Anna. I've been lonely for 6 years. This is wrong." He let the silence run. "I'm going to go get her," he said. "If she'll come back. She might not. I said what I said, and she's not a woman who forgets what she hears. But I'm going anyway." He stood there a moment longer. "I should have let Moses tell me the truth about that night years ago," he said. "I should have come back down off this mountain long enough to hear it. I'm sorry it took me this long." The wind came down off the ridge and moved through the juniper branches. He turned. He walked back to the roan and mounted and pointed her south. He rode down the mountain. He had one good shirt. He found it in the chest under the loft where it had been since the last time he'd worn it. A town occasion 2 years ago that he couldn't now remember the specifics of. Dark cotton, no tears, no stains. He put it on. He shaved using the small mirror fixed to the cabin window frame. He combed his hair, which was an act of such unusual personal attention that the comb nearly got away from him. He studied himself in the glass. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense. He was large and weathered, and the years on the mountain were written into him in ways that a shave and a clean shirt didn't undo. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent his life doing things that damage hands. His face had the particular set of someone who has spent more time looking at distances than at people. He looked exactly like what he was. A mountain man who had been alone too long and was going down into the world to fix a mistake. He put on his coat and went out and mounted the roan and rode south. The road down from the ridge was mud and meltwater and the smell of new growth coming up through last year's dead grass. The pines thinned as he descended, and the sky opened ahead of him wide and gray-blue over the valley, and Pell's Crossing appeared in the distance as a cluster of dark shapes against the spring brown of the flatland. He rode in at midday. He tied the roan in front of the trading post. He stood in the street a moment, not for the geography which he knew, for the other kind of bearing, the bearing of a man about to do something that can't be undone and is taking one clear breath before he does it. He went inside. The trading post was busy for a Tuesday. 4 or 5 people he recognized Jed Pell behind the counter, and in the far corner, in the chair that was always in the far corner, Henry Marsh. Henry Marsh was somewhere north of 70, and had arrived at his current age through a series of decisions that had worked out better than they had any right to. He sat in his corner with his hat on and his hands in his lap, and observed everything that happened in Pell's Crossing with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who has decided that observation is the most interesting thing left available to him. Samuel went to the counter. He asked Jed Pell where Ruth Calloway's boarding house was. He knew roughly, but he wanted the exact location. Pell gave it to him with the expression of a man who has already formed conclusions and is storing them for later use. Samuel turned to go. "Crawford." He stopped. Henry Marsh had not moved from his chair. His voice was the voice of a man who doesn't speak often and has consequently developed a gift for being heard when he does. Samuel walked over. Henry looked up from under the hat brim. "Sit down a minute," he said. Samuel sat. Henry held him in the thorough, unhurried attention of someone who has been waiting for this exact conversation and intends to have it properly. I was at the post office, Henry said, the night of the storm, the bad one 6 years ago, the one that took your Anna. Samuel held absolutely still. You came through here going south, Henry said, running, worst storm I'd seen in 10 years. You were going to the settlement to find the midwife because yours hadn't come. A pause. I watched you go. The trading post moved around them, no one paying attention to the two men in the corner. You didn't come back in time, Henry said. I know that. The whole town knows how that ended, but they don't know why you weren't there. They figured you were out on the mountain and got caught. They figured it was bad luck and distance. It was, Samuel said. No, Henry said. It wasn't distance, it wasn't bad luck either. You were running toward her. You went into a storm that should have killed a man trying to bring her help, and you couldn't make the miles in time. That is a different account from the one you've been settling against yourself. Samuel stared at the floorboards. I never said anything, Henry said, because you went up that mountain and you didn't come back down and there was no way to say it to you. And then years went by. He held Samuel's eyes directly. But you're here now, and you're about to go do whatever you're dressed up to go do. And I thought you should carry the true version of that night with you when you go. Samuel sat with it. 6 years of carrying a conviction that had been built on an incomplete account of a single night. 6 years of a sentence served for the wrong crime. Why didn't you come up the mountain, he said, years ago? Why didn't you say it then? Henry looked at him with the faint, dry expression of a man too old to be surprised by anything but still capable of finding it interesting. I'm 73 years old, he said. That is a steep road. Something moved through Samuel's chest. Not laughter, but the ghost of what laughter used to feel like, remembering the shape of itself. Thank you, he said. Go on, Henry said. Go do what you came down here to do. Samuel stood. He put his hat on. He walked out into the street, turned left toward Ruth Calloway's boarding house and went. Ruth answered the door. She was a compact, practical woman in her middle 40s who had the look of someone offered the option of becoming bitter about her life and had declined it on practical grounds. She held Samuel Crawford on her porch in his good shirt and recently shaved face and spent a moment in honest evaluation. Room 2, she said. She stepped aside. He went in. He went to the door at the end of the hall. He knocked. A beat of silence. Then, come in. He opened the door. Clara was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with a book in her lap she clearly hadn't been reading. Fully dressed, coat on, boots on, with the alertness of someone who has been expecting something, though perhaps not this. She took him in. He took her in. On the bedside table, a stagecoach ticket to Billings. He could see it from the door. He could see it had not been torn up. He came in. He took off his hat. He stood in the small room and didn't speak immediately, not because the words weren't there, but because he was making certain they were the right ones and the right order for them, and was not going to let fear put them in the wrong sequence a second time. I answered your question wrong, he said. Not wrong in the sense of dishonest. Wrong in the sense of I told you the truth, but I told it in the order that fear chose, not the order that's true. She sat with her hands still on the book. The land came first in what I said, he continued. The land shouldn't have come first. The land is a piece of ground on a mountain. It matters, and I won't pretend it doesn't, but it is not. He stopped. He held her eyes directly the way he'd held them in the lantern light of the barn, with nothing between the looking and the truth of what he saw. You came into that cabin and the cabin became different, he said. Not fixed up, not warmer in the literal sense, different in the way of a place that has been empty for a long time and then isn't. I knew every corner of that cabin for 6 years, and I thought I knew what it was. And then you were in it, and I found out what it was missing. He paused. It was you specifically, he said. The way you read, the way you talked to that horse, the chair. I didn't build that chair for the arrangement. I built it because you were sitting on the edge of a cot, and that was wrong. I built it because I'd been watching where you sat and how you sat without letting myself know I was doing it. The room was completely still. I sent that letter because I was desperate and the land had a deadline and the silence was eating me alive, he said. All of that is true, but that's not why I want you to come back. I want you to come back because the cabin is wrong without you. and I know the difference between lonely and wrong." Clara held his gaze. She held it a long time. Then she turned her eyes to the ticket on the table, back to him, to the ticket once more. "Dalton is trying to take the land," she said, "if I leave." "I know," he said. "Moses told me. So I could be walking back into the same arrangement I left." "Yes," he said. "You could see it that way." "How do you see it?" He held her eyes. "I see it as me asking my wife to come home. The land is something that exists alongside that. It's not the reason." "You're certain of that?" "Clara." His voice went down into its lowest register. "I went to Anna's grave this morning before I came down here. I told her I'd been using her memory as a wall, that what I called a promise was fear dressed up in sacrifice's clothing, that I was coming down off the mountain to find you, and I didn't know if you'd come back with me, but I was coming anyway." She held him in her gaze, not searching, assessing, the way she assessed everything. "I've been afraid since she died," he said. "Afraid of exactly this, of what I was starting to feel when I sat across that table from you. I thought feeling it meant losing it, same as before. I thought the mountain would take you the way it took her, and the only way to stop that was to not—" He stopped. "I talked myself into saying the wrong thing because the right thing was more terrifying than losing you. And now you've been gone 6 days," he said, "and I've learned that losing you is more terrifying than the right thing." The evening light came through the small window in a thin band across the floor between them. Clara held the ticket. She held it a moment. Samuel didn't move. She tore it in half. She set the 2 pieces back on the table and kept her eyes on them, and then she raised her eyes to him, and something in her face that had been held very carefully in check, braced, controlled, maintained against impact, came slightly undone at the edges. Not tears, not collapse. Just the very slight unlocking of something that had been braced for impact so long it had forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. "You built the chair before you knew you were building it for me," she said. "Yes." "You measured me without measuring me." "Yes." She was quiet with that a moment. "That is either the most practical form of love I have ever encountered," she said, "or you are a very peculiar man." "Both," he said. The left corner of her mouth, the scarred side, moved in the way it moved when something had genuinely reached her and she was deciding what to do about it. "My trunk is already packed," she said. "I know," he said. "Can I carry it?" "Yes," she said. "You can carry it." He lifted the trunk. She put on her hat. She went to the door first and stopped and turned back to him. "Samuel." "Yes." "The next time I ask you a question like that," she said, "I need you to answer it in your order, not fear's order." He held her eyes. "Yes," he said. She went out the door. He carried the trunk down the hall out into the evening air of Pell's Crossing, where the spring light was long and gold across the mud of the main street, and the mountains to the north stood dark against a sky that was clearing to the first deep blue of evening. He loaded the trunk on the pack horse. She was already in the saddle. He mounted the roan. They rode north. They rode out of Pell's Crossing in the last of the evening light, and neither of them said very much for the first few miles. That was all right. They had learned over 11 weeks of living in close quarters in a small cabin on a cold mountain that silence between 2 people is not always the same thing. There is the silence of strangers, which has a hollow quality to it, like sound moving through an empty room. There is the silence of people who have nothing left to say. And then there is the silence of people who have said the necessary things and are now simply moving forward together, carrying what was said the way you carry something you've been holding for a long time, differently now, with a different distribution of the weight. This was the third kind. Clara rode with her back straight and her eyes on the road ahead and her hands easy on the reins, and Samuel rode beside her on the roan with the pack-horse trailing, and the mountain came up around them as the light went thin and the first stars appeared above the ridge. At the bend in the road where the trail started climbing in earnest, where the flat valley land fell away behind them and the pines closed in on either side, Clara said, "How is her leg?" It took him a half-second to understand she meant the roan. "Healed clean," he said. "Walk sound." "Good." She looked at the horse beneath her. I thought about her, on the road down, whether the rap had held. He looked at her profile against the darkening sky. It held, he said. She nodded. She looked at the trail ahead. He looked at the trail ahead. The pines moved in a small wind coming down off the high country, and the smell of them came with it, pine sap and cold rock, and the green smell of the new growth pushing up along the creek beds. He had ridden this road alone hundreds of times. It was a different road now. They were almost to the last rise before the cabin clearing when they heard the horse behind them. Samuel heard at first the particular sound of a well-shod horse moving at a deliberate pace up a mountain road. He didn't look back immediately. He listened. One horse, moving fast enough to be purposeful, slow enough to not be panicked. He knew the cadence of it. "Dalton," he said quietly. Clara's hands tightened on her reins slightly. Then they loosened. "What does he want now?" "To make a point, most likely," Samuel said. "He's a man who likes to have the last word in a room he didn't control." They came over the rise. The cabin was there in the clearing below them. Dark windows, cold chimney, the wood pile and the barn, and the familiar shapes of a place that had become, over 4 months, something other than what it had been. Samuel felt it the way you feel a thing you didn't realize you were oriented to until you came back to it after being away. He stopped the roan at the top of the rise. Clara stopped beside him. Behind them, Dalton came over the lower bend and pulled up about 30 yards back. He sat his horse in the gathering dark and looked at them, at both of them together at the top of the rise with the cabin behind them, and something moved across his face that was not quite any one emotion, but contained pieces of several. He rode up slowly, stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the pack horse, at the trunk tied to its back, at Clara sitting her horse with that straight-spined, level-eyed quality that she brought to every difficult thing. He looked at Samuel. "I see," he said. "Yes," Samuel said. Dalton was quiet for a moment. He was doing something internally. Samuel could see it the way you see a man recalculating when the figures have changed. Dalton was not a simple man. He was complicated in the way of someone who has mixed genuine grievances with opportunistic ones for so long that he could no longer clearly separate them. "The lawyer in Billings," Samuel said. Dalton looked at him. "Call him off." "The arrangement is 12 years old and was never legal," Samuel said. "You know that, I know that. We both knew it when we made it, which is why you need a lawyer now and couldn't just walk up here with a deed." He paused. "It's done, Dalton. Whatever we had between us, it's been done for years. You've known that, and you've been waiting for something to collect on." Dalton looked at him for a long, flat moment. "You never once thanked me," he said, "for the land, for pointing you to it." Something shifted in Samuel's chest. Not guilt, not exactly. Something older. "No," he said. "I didn't. That was wrong of me." Whatever Dalton had expected, it was not that. The admission landed, and he sat with it. "I should have," Samuel said. "You put me onto this country when I was young and didn't know where to go. I built something here because you told me where to look. That's the truth of it, and I should have said so a long time ago." Dalton looked at the cabin. He looked at Clara. He looked at Samuel. The evening had gone full dark above the ridge, and the first of the cold was coming in from the northwest, and the pines were moving in it, and everything smelled like spring and mountain and the long, clean distance of a country that does not concern itself with the settlements of men. "The lawyer," Dalton said finally. "I'll tell him to put the papers away." "Thank you," Samuel said. Dalton turned his horse. He rode about 10 yards, then stopped. He looked back, not at Samuel, at Clara. His expression had changed. The calculation was gone from it. What was left was something simpler, and because of that, considerably harder to look at. "Mrs. Crawford," he said. Clara looked at him. "I said things to you," Dalton said. "At your cabin. Things I said as tactics, that things I shouldn't have said. About Crawford being ashamed." He paused. "He wasn't. I knew that when I said it. I said it anyway." Clara held his gaze. "All right," she said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement. Received and filed and moved past." Clara Bowen did not require more from apologies than what they actually were. Dalton nodded once. He rode south. They listened to his horse until the sound was gone, and then there was only the wind and the pines and the dark clearing below them, with the cold cabin at its center. "He's gone," Clara said. "He's gone," Samuel agreed. She looked at the cabin. "We should get a fire started." "Yes," he said. They rode down. The fire took immediately. Clara had a gift for fires, the kind of gift that comes from years of needing fire in conditions where it didn't come easily. She had the kindling caught and the first split logs across before Samuel had finished with the horses, and by the time he came in from the barn the cabin was beginning to breathe warmth. He stood inside the door and watched the fire. The light moved across the familiar surfaces: the stone hearth, the rough table, the shelves, the hanging pelts on the west wall, the tool rack by the door. All of it exactly as it had been before she left, except the shelf where her books had been empty for 6 days. Clara set her 3 books back on the shelf. She did it without ceremony, the same way she did most things, directly and without making a performance of it. She set the first book, then the second, then the third. Then she set the notebook behind them the way he'd found it. She turned and found him watching. She did not look embarrassed. "Where do you keep the coffee?" she said. "Same place it's always been," he said. "I know where you keep it." A pause. "I was giving you something to say." He almost smiled. Almost. "Second shelf. Left side." "Thank you," she said gravely, and went to make coffee. He hung up his coat. He sat at the table. The chair was still there, her chair, and she would sit in it later, and the sound of the cabin would be right again, and the light from the fire would fall across both of them the way it was meant to. He put his hands flat on the table. He sat with the fact of her being back in the room, and tried to let it be ordinary, which it was not and might not be for some time. She put 2 cups on the table and sat in her chair. He looked at his coffee. "The notebook," he said. "What you wrote in it." "Yes." "You wrote that you thought I was learning how to want to stay." "Yes." "You were right." "I know," she said. "I was right, and you were learning it, and you still said what you said." "Yes." She looked at her coffee. "I know why you said it. I've had 6 days to sit with it, and I understand the mechanics of it. Fear talks in a certain direction, and you let it." "I did. I need to know it won't talk in that direction again." She looked up at him. "I'm not asking for a guarantee. I know you can't give one. I'm asking for honesty. When fear is talking, tell me it's fear. Don't let it answer for you and leave me interpreting." "I can do that," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "All right," she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. The fire settled into itself with a low, comfortable sound, and outside the wind came down off the ridge and said what it always said against the walls of the cabin, and the cabin held against it the way it always had. For the first time in 6 days, the holding felt like enough. April moved into May. The mountain changed the way it changes when it has finally decided to commit to the season, not gently, not gradually, but with the sudden conviction of a place that does not do anything halfway. The snow pulled back to the high north faces. The creek came up fast with meltwater and ran loud and cold through the lower trees. The meadow on the south side of the ridge, which had been brown and flat since October, went green almost overnight, a startling, almost aggressive green, the color of a country making up for lost time. They planted a garden. It was Clara's idea, though. Samuel had been thinking about it without saying so. The south-facing strip along the cabin wall where the snow left first and the light came longest. She had seeds she'd been carrying in a paper envelope since Pell's Crossing kept dry through the whole winter in the inside of her trunk. She brought them out one morning in early May with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has been waiting for the right conditions and has recognized them arriving. They worked the soil together on a cold, clear morning, breaking the frozen crust with a pick and working down to the softer earth beneath. Samuel dug. Clara broke the clods and raked them flat. They worked side by side without discussion of method or division of labor, each finding the natural complement to what the other was doing the same way they'd found the complement in the barn during the blizzard. Clara showed him how deep she wanted the rows and the spacing she preferred. He showed her where the drainage ran and which end of the strip got the most afternoon light. She planted the seeds in careful rows, working slowly, pressing each one into the soil to the right depth by feel. He watched her hands in the dark earth. "My mother had a garden," she said. Not sadly, just as information. "What did she grow?" "Beans, tomatoes, herbs she'd dry and hang from the kitchen beams." A pause. "She had a gift for it. Things grew for her that other women couldn't keep alive." He looked at her hands in the soil. "After the fire," she said, she couldn't." She stopped. She pressed a seed into the earth. "She left. I told you that. She left me with my aunt, and she left." "Yes," he said. "I used to think the garden was the thing she loved," Clara said. "More than I used to think that was the important detail. That she could grow things, but she couldn't." She stopped again, pressed another seed. "But I've been thinking about it differently lately." He waited. "I think she was someone who only knew how to love beautiful things," Clara said. "And after the fire I didn't look the way I had, and she didn't know what to do with that, so she left." She smoothed the soil over a row. "It wasn't cruelty, it was smallness, and smallness isn't the same as cruelty even when it costs as much." He was quiet for a moment. "She missed knowing you," he said. Clara looked up at him. He was not looking at her. He was working the soil at the far end of the row with the spade head down in the tone of someone who has said a thing without planning to and is letting it stand or fall on its own. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "She did." She went back to planting. He went back to digging. The morning moved around them cold and clean and quiet, and the mountain went about its April business of turning from one thing into another, and the seeds went into the dark earth in careful rows, each one placed with the intention of becoming something. Moses came by in the second week of May, the way Moses came by without announcement, arriving at the cabin at a time that suggested he'd calculated the ride to coincide with the coffee being ready. He sat at the table and looked around the cabin and drank his coffee. He looked at the rug by the door, at the herbs on the rafter beam, at the 2 cups on the table both in use, at the books on the shelf, at the chair by the fire with the impression of long use worked into the cushion Clara had made for it from a piece of old wool blanket. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at Samuel and at Clara and back at Samuel. "Better," he said. "Yes," Samuel said. "Considerably better." "Yes." Moses drank his coffee. He looked at Clara. "How's the east trail after the melt?" "Passable," she said. "Muddy below the second switchback. There's a section where the runoff has cut across the road about a mile down. It'll need regrading before summer." Moses looked at her with the frank evaluating attention of a man who respects competence above most other things. "You've been down it recently?" "Last week. Rode down for some things Jed Pell had set aside." "Alone." "Samuel was on the northern line. I know the road." Moses looked at Samuel. Samuel kept his eyes on his coffee. "Good," Moses said. He refilled his cup. He sat back. He had the look of a man who has several things he could say and is deciding which ones were worth the effort. "Dalton called his lawyer off," he said finally. "I know," Samuel said. "He told me." "You talked to him?" "On the road, the night we came back." Moses turned his cup. "How did that go?" "Reasonably," Samuel said. "I thanked him for the land. 12 years late, but I did it." Moses looked at him for a long moment. "Well," he said. That was all. But from Moses, well said in that particular tone carried the weight of a longer speech from most people. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He pulled on his coat with the careful movements of a man whose joints have opinions about weather. At the door he stopped. He looked at Clara. "He's stubborn," Moses said. "Slow to say things. You'll have to get used to that." "I'm aware," Clara said. "He means more than he says. Most of the time." "I know. And he makes good coffee." "The best I've had." Moses looked at Samuel with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as his face was built to express. "All right," he said. He went out into the spring morning. They listened to his horse for a while moving north along the ridge trail. Then Clara picked up her book and Samuel picked up the harness he'd been repairing, and the cabin was quiet and right, and the fire burned low and comfortable in the hearth. Summer came. It came the way Montana summer comes to the high country, brief and brilliant and almost too beautiful to look at directly the way things are, beautiful when they only happen once a year, and the rest of the time is preparation and aftermath. The meadows went thick with wildflowers. The pines stood in the long evening light like something painted. The creek settled from its spring violence to a clear, cold, fast-moving thing that caught the light and threw it back in pieces. The garden grew. It grew with a deliberateness that Clara watched with satisfaction, and Samuel watched with something that he would not have called wonder, but which operated in the same neighborhood. Green things coming up where there had been only dirt and intention. Beans climbing the small stakes he'd driven for them. Tomato plants low and determined in their row. Herbs that Clara clipped for the kitchen and hung from the rafter beam next to the ones that had been there since winter, filling the cabin with a smell that had no equivalent in the vocabulary of a man who had lived alone on a mountain for 6 years. The cabin continued its slow transformation. Not dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a single change that made the difference. Just the accumulation of small things over time, a curtain for the loft opening made from cloth Clara had bought at Pell's Crossing in the spring. A bench on the south side of the cabin outside where the afternoon light fell longest. A proper kitchen shelf with pegs for the cast iron and a board for the jars, replacing the rough arrangement that had served 11 years of bachelor practicality. Samuel made the bench without being asked. He set it outside on a Saturday morning and said nothing about it. Clara came out later and sat on it with her coffee and watched the light change on the ridge. He came and sat beside her. They sat there a long time. It was a good bench. At Pell's Crossing, the story of Samuel Crawford and his mail-order bride had gone through several iterations by midsummer, the way stories do in small settlements where there is not enough news to satisfy the demand for it. The first version, the one current in February and March, had been the version Dalton had helped along the mountain man, and the scarred woman, the charity arrangement, the inevitable failure of it. The second version had emerged from the events of April. Samuel coming down off the mountain in his good shirt, the conversation at the boarding house, the ride back north together. That version had a different quality to it. People told it differently depending on who they were and what they thought of Samuel Crawford, but most versions agreed on the essential shape of it. A man who had been wrong about something important had done what was needed to be less wrong about it. By summer, a third version had quietly replaced both of the others. This one didn't have a particular dramatic incident at its center. It was just what people observed when Samuel and Clara came down to the trading post every few weeks for supplies. The way they moved alongside each other. The way Clara spoke to people directly without apology, without the brittle defensiveness of someone who expects to be diminished. The way Samuel, who had been for years the kind of man that other men respected from a distance and avoided getting close to, had developed the capacity visible to anyone paying attention to stand next to someone and be simply uncomplicated present. Mrs. Hartwell had come to the trading post one Saturday in June when both Samuel and Clara were there, and had approached Clara with a jar of preserved plums and a slightly different expression than the one she'd been wearing in February. "From my garden," she'd said. "The summer crop came in well." Clara had taken the jar and thanked her, and that had been the end of it, which Mrs. Hartwell had seemed to find both easier and more difficult than she'd expected. Jed Pell had started filling their orders a little faster than he used to. Henry Marsh had been on 2 subsequent occasions seen to nod at Samuel Crawford when their paths crossed, not the careful acknowledging nod of a man maintaining cordial distance, but the other kind. The kind between people who share a piece of information that no one else in the room has. And Marcus Dalton, who still came to the trading post on Tuesdays and still stood at the counter with his hat pushed back, had on one notable occasion watched Samuel and Clara come in and load their supplies and ride out, and had said nothing to anyone about it, and had drunk his coffee with an expression that was not contentment, but was at least no longer the calculating hunger that had been there before. He had called his lawyer off. He had not become a different man, but he had become a man who had closed a particular account, and there was in that closing a kind of relief that sat on him whether he wanted it there or not. One morning in the last week of July, Samuel woke before Clara and came down the loft ladder in the gray pre-dawn light to find the cabin quiet and the fire down to a steady bed of coals and Clara's chair empty. She was not on the cot. The cot had not been used as a bed in months. He stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment. Then he saw. She was standing at the small mirror on the window frame. Samuel's mirror, the one he used for shaving, fixed to the frame with 2 nails and a piece of wire about the size of a man's 2 hands placed side by side. Not a vanity mirror. Not the kind of mirror a person would choose for looking at themselves. Just a functional piece of silvered glass in a serviceable wood frame. She was standing in front of it in the early morning light with her hair down around her shoulders and her face, both sides of it, the smooth and the scarred, turned toward the glass. She didn't know he was there. He stood very still. He had thought about this in the months since she'd arrived. He had wondered what she saw when she looked at her own face, whether she looked at all. She never used the mirror when he was around. He had noticed that, filed it without comment, understood it as one of the private territories a person maintains when they live in close quarters with someone else. He watched her stand there in the early light. She was not doing what he might have expected. She was not examining the scar with the careful scrutiny of someone conducting an assessment. She was not studying herself with the pained attention of someone looking for evidence of what they've lost. She was just looking at herself the way you look at a thing that is simply factually yours. That belongs to you and you to it, and the relationship between you and it has been arrived at honestly through a long process of negotiation that is now in some fundamental way complete. She raised her right hand and touched the left side of her face. Not the scar specifically, just her face, the way a person touches something they have decided to stop being afraid of. Then she dropped her hand. She looked at herself for another moment, and then she smiled. Not a complicated smile, not a smile that was about anything difficult. Just a smile in the morning the way a person smiles when they wake up and the day is in front of them and there is in that particular moment nothing wrong with anything. The left corner of her mouth, the scarred side, lifted the same as the right. She turned from the mirror. She saw Samuel standing at the bottom of the loft ladder. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look caught. She looked at him with the level, direct gaze that had been the first thing he'd really seen of her on a frozen morning in February in the mud of Pell's Crossing, and something in that gaze was different from the way it had been on that morning. Not different in character, different in ease. "Coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. She went to the shelf to get it. He stood at the bottom of the ladder a moment longer, looking at the mirror. Then he went to the table and sat down. The summer evenings were long on the mountain. They would sit on the bench outside the cabin after supper when the work was done and the horses were settled and the garden had been checked and the day was winding down into the particular gold and purple of a Montana evening. The ridge went dark against a sky that held the light long after the sun was gone, and the valley below was already in shadow, while the high country still burned with the last of it. Clara sewed sometimes, or read. Samuel whittled not objects, particularly just the motion of it, the wood and the knife, and the thinking that happened when his hands were occupied. Occasionally they talked. About what needed doing the next day, about what Moses had said on his last visit about the garden, and how the beans were coming, and whether the tomatoes would ripen before the first frost came. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. On an evening in early August, with the fireflies beginning to show in the meadow below the cabin, and the first stars coming through above the ridge, Clara set down her mending and looked at the mountain. "I've been thinking about the winter," she said. "What about it?" "Last winter, your winter, it's different from any winter I knew before. Where I grew up, winter was cold and gray and something to get through." She paused. "Here, it's something else. It's a thing that has opinions about you." He looked at the ridge. "Yes. I want to be ready for it," she said. "Properly ready. Not the way I was last year, which was ready in the sense of having come from somewhere I didn't know enough to be afraid of it. You handled it fine." "I handled it fine because you knew what you were doing, and I could learn from watching," she said. "I want to know what I'm doing myself, on my own terms." He looked at her. "Teach me what you know," she said. "The weather, how to read it, what the animals do when something is coming, how to tell the difference between a bad storm and a killing one." He was quiet for a moment. "That'll take more than a summer," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at his hands. He looked at the mountain. "We'll start with the ravens," he said. "All right. How they fly, the angle they hold their wings when the pressure is changing. Once you learn that you'll know weather coming in 12 hours before it arrives. And the rest? The rest takes time. You'll know most of it by the end of next winter. And what I don't know by then," he looked at her, "the winter after that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her mending. "The winter after that," she said, as if she were writing it down somewhere. He looked at the ridge. The fireflies were going now, rising from the meadow in their small, cold lights, dozens of them, then hundreds, the meadow alive with blinking points of light like a sky turned upside down. Clara set her mending in her lap and watched them. "I used to think this country would kill you," she said, "when I first came, in February. I thought, how does anything survive this?" "Things are built for it," he said, "the ones that belong here." "Yes." She watched the fireflies. "I understand that now." He looked at her profile in the fading light. She was watching the meadow with the same full attention she gave to reading, that complete, unhurried quality of someone who has decided that whatever is in front of them right now is worth all of them, not just the part available between other things. He thought about what it had cost her to be here. Not the practical cost, the long road from wherever she'd been before the agency, the letter that had described him in terms that were accurate but insufficient, the February morning when she'd stepped off a stagecoach into an unknown life on a mountain she'd never seen and pulled her scarf down for a man who had looked at the ground. All of that. And she had stayed. She had stayed and worked and waited and asked for almost nothing, and given almost everything, her presence, her competence, her careful, watchful, genuine attention. And when he had finally failed her in the one way that mattered, she had gone, which was the correct thing to do. And when he had come after her with the right words in the right order, she had torn a ticket in half and come back. That was who she was. He had been looking at the ground the first time he saw her. He was not looking at the ground now. "Clara." She turned. He looked at her directly, both sides of her face, the smooth and the scarred, the dark eyes, the way the last light was falling across her, the way she was entirely, completely herself, in a way he had not seen in another person in a very long time, if he ever had. "I'm glad you came down on that stage," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you were standing outside when I did," she said. He put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She turned her hand over. They sat like that in the August evening, with the fireflies rising from the meadow and the mountain going dark above them, and the cabin behind them warm and lit and full of the small marks of a life being built by two people who had been each in their own way waiting to build it without quite knowing that was what they were doing. September brought the first edge of cold back into the nights, the first hint of what was coming. The way September always does in the high country, that early warning that summer is a loan and not a gift, and the collateral is the months to come. Samuel checked the stores. He cut firewood. He walked the property with the systematic attention of a man who has learned to think ahead by 2 seasons, what would be needed, what was sufficient, what would require a trip down to Pell's Crossing before the road got uncertain. Clara pickled the last of the garden. She dried the herbs and hung them from the rafter beam beside the ones from last year, and the cabin smelled like summer preserved, like something that would carry through the dark months as a reminder that the dark months end. The tomatoes had ripened. This was a matter of some significance because Clara had not been entirely certain they would. The altitude was marginal for tomatoes, and she'd said so when she planted them, and Samuel had said nothing either way, not wanting to discourage her. But they had ripened small and red and abundant, and she had stood in the garden on the morning she'd found them and looked at them with an expression that was not triumph exactly, but was the face of a person who has tried something that mattered and found that it worked. He'd come out to find her standing there. He'd looked at the tomatoes. "Told you," he said. "You didn't say anything," she said. "I thought it." She had picked the first one and handed it to him. He'd eaten it standing in the garden in the September morning, which was not a thing he would have predicted himself doing, and found it the best thing he'd tasted since the last time she'd cooked something from it. She had watched him eat it with the expression she got when something had worked out. Moses came up in the second week of September for what he said was a supply check, and what was actually a social visit because Moses had been making social visits to this cabin for years and had learned to describe them as practical matters in order to preserve some dignity. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and looked around the cabin and was quiet for a while. "Henry Marsh says to tell you the road work got done," he said. "The washout from the spring, county put men on it." "Good," Samuel said. "He also says Dalton's been talking about selling the lower pasture land, moving north." Might be nothing." Moses turned his cup. "Might be a man who's decided this particular chapter is over." Samuel looked at the fire. "Some chapters need to be over," he said. Moses looked at him. "Yes," he said, "they do." He finished his coffee. He stood. He looked once more around the cabin at the curtain on the loft opening, at the garden visible through the south window, at the 2 chairs by the hearth, at the row of books on the shelf and the small notebook behind them. He put on his coat. "It's a good cabin," he said. "Yes," Samuel said. "It looks like people live here." "Yes," Clara said. "It does." Moses nodded at the door. He went out. October. The first snow came on a Thursday in the night, soft and without drama. Not a storm, just the mountain's reminder that the arrangement was back in effect. Samuel found 2 inches of it on the woodpile in the morning and stood in the cabin doorway for a moment looking at the clearing gone white and the pine trees with their new weight of snow and the sky that had the particular flat gray that meant more was coming. Clara appeared at his shoulder with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the snow. "Earlier than last year," she said, "by about a week." "Is that a sign of anything?" "Hard winter," he said. She handed him his cup. He took it. "We have enough wood," she said. "Add 2 more cords and we'll be comfortable. I'll help after breakfast." "I know," he said. She went back inside. He stood in the doorway a moment longer with his coffee, looking at the snow, looking at the cabin clearing with its familiar shapes all softened and whitened, looking at the place where the trail came down from the ridge and the place where the barn stood and the strip of dark earth along the south wall where the garden had been bare now and frost-hardened, waiting for what came next. He thought about last February. He thought about a woman stepping down from a stagecoach and pulling a scarf from her face in the cold mud of Pell's Crossing, and a man who had looked at the ground. He thought about what had happened in the months between that morning and this one. It was not a simple story. It had been in the middle of it a story he'd been close to ruining with his own hands, which is the most common way good things get ruined. It had required things from him that he had been very reluctant to provide: honesty and the willingness to be wrong, and the harder willingness to keep going after he'd been wrong, which is in some ways harder than not being wrong in the first place. It had required things from Clara that he did not take lightly and would not take for granted. He thought about the notebook. He is learning how to want to stay. He looked at the snow on the woodpile. He thought about the word that had followed him into the pine trees in early spring, the one he'd pushed away for weeks, the one he'd been afraid of, and he let it be what it was. Home. Not the cabin specifically, not the land or the mountain or the particular latitude and longitude of this place in the Montana high country. The thing that was inside the cabin, the fire she'd laid, the 2 cups on the table, the herbs on the rafter beam, the chair he'd built for a person he hadn't admitted to himself he was building it for, the sound of pages turning in the dark, the woman who had come down a mountain road at midnight in a blizzard to help him hold a frightened horse, who had written in small, careful letters in a notebook she thought he'd never read that she thought he was learning how to want to stay, who had torn a stagecoach ticket in half and said, "My trunk is already packed," and let him carry it. He turned from the door. Clara was at the hearth tending the fire that was already going because she'd laid it while he'd been standing in the doorway. The cabin was warm. The coffee was good. The smell of it and the wood smoke and the herbs and the general smell of a place that is lived in properly, that is heated and cooked in and worked in and slept in by people who have decided it is theirs, moved through the room like something earned. She looked up at him. He looked at her. "Breakfast," she said. "Yes," he said. He closed the cabin door against the cold. People still tell the story in that part of the country on the long winter evenings when the fire is going and there's nowhere better to be. They tell it differently depending on who's telling it. Some versions are shorter, some longer. Some people add details that weren't there and leave out things that were. That's what happens to stories over time. They find the shape they need. But the part that everyone agrees on, the part that stays the same in every version, is the ending. Not an ending with fanfare, not the kind you'd put in a newspaper. Just this: up on the eastern shoulder of the ridge, the Crow people called the place where the wind argues with itself, there is a cabin. Has been there for years. If you're on the mountain road on a cold night, the kind of night when the wind comes down off the high country and the pines are loud with it, and the dark is the particular dark of a place that doesn't apologize for what it is. You can see a light in the window, small, steady, the kind of light that doesn't move and doesn't go out. People who know the story know what it means. It means the fire is going. It means someone is home. It means two people who were each in their own way done with the idea of belonging anywhere, found a piece of country and a piece of each other, and built something that held. Not because the frontier got easier, not because the winters got shorter, but because they chose every day in the small daily language of coffee poured and wood split and chairs built and pages turned and hands held in the dark. They chose each other. And in that choosing, the place became what places become when people love them properly. It became home. And the light in the window burned on.